All right, so this is a suggestion via Patreon. The name of the video is how the U.S. is beating inflation. Bro, we're not. Let's get it. But all right, let's check it out.
The U.S. seems to be winning its battle against inflation. Prices have slowly begun to descend. And hopefully, prices should continue to come down. At least, that's what people expect to happen.
Hope.
It turns out Americans' inflation expectations really do matter.
People really do behave in accordance with their expectations and with their sentiment and attitudes towards the economy.
Inflation has moved down from its peak, a welcome development. It remains too high. We are prepared to raise rates further.
Bro, fire this man. I'm over him. Listen, if you tell me you're going to raise rates again, I'm writing a letter, guys. All right? Listen, the rates are already too high. I understand the reason why the rates are high is so we can stop using money, right? The moral of the story here is stop going out and buying things. That will force the market to kind of reset. But the fact is that the overall pressures of us being in this inflationary period is telling us what? If we don't buy it now, it's going to be more expensive in a couple of months. That's overall in our psyche. So we're out here spending money. The most people we don't have, guys, right? We're spending money exclusively on things that we think that we're going to need, and if we don't get it now, it's giving us a sense of urgency. So a lot of these companies are making mega bucks from that very specific thing. But the fact that we're still out here doing this, creating more credit debt, yeah, the inflation is just going to get worse. It's not going to get worse until we stop going out and buying things. Really, that's it. But all right, let's get it.
Theoretically, conceptually, it makes sense. If households really think about 2% inflation, they can kind of make it happen, right? By changing their behavior.
But financial markets are anxiously awaiting to see if inflation is truly decreasing.
My concern is there's too much confidence in the potential of how this whole inflation thing plays out. My biggest concern is that's already priced into the markets.
Consumer spending have been especially robust. Additional evidence of persistently above trend growth could put further progress on inflation at risk.
The Federal Reserve cannot cool off the economy if they don't cool off consumers.
Here's how inflation expectations are measured, why the Fed cares so much about them, and how the
Bro, just lower the interest rates. It didn't work. Whatever you thought was going to work didn't work. All right, just allow us under 40s to come in and be able to utilize some of that, upward mobility to kind of, purchase houses, purchase lands and things like that, just so we can kind of build. Get what I mean here? But if you keep locking everyone out, they're going to keep spending on other things. Right? I mean, if they have no access to, owning their own house ever because they can't afford it. Why? Because the interest rate is ridiculous. Yeah, they're going to just keep spending money. Retail therapy on nonsense until they can eventually afford something.
The idea of higher prices in the future can actually manifest them.
We are manifesting higher prices because, again, we're not stopping spending.
Inflation expectations are the rate at which people expect prices to rise or fall in the future.
For decades, inflation expectations have been fairly stable, and inflation was fairly stable.
But the coronavirus pandemic caused a massive shift in those expectations. Or rather, think of expectations as inflation mentality.
They use terminology. I mean, like the inflation expectations, just like, I don't know what that is. Like, a more approachable label is an inflation mentality.
What consumers believe may happen in the future can influence actual inflation.
Modern day spending.
Inflation expectations refers to what people believe inflation is going to be in the future. It will be informed by, what they're seeing now, and that's really what's going to be affecting their behavior today, which is why we care about it.
Inflation expectations play a crucial role in the decisions made by the Federal Reserve. It's part of how they meet their mandate to reach maximum sustainable employment and maintain stable prices.
So the way I actually think of it is that we're sitting in a car together. The car is the economy, and consumers are deciding what to do based on where they think the road's going. But at any time, the Fed might stick a traffic light somewhere or steer us into an off-ramp. Then the road's going to look different down the line. But it's always going to take a while. Like the policymakers might make a small adjustment to the road down the line, and it'll take a while for consumers to recognize the road doesn't look the way it did before.
Guys, this is the reason why there's so much information about they mentioned layoffs, right? So the unemployment numbers are really important because the unemployment numbers means that generally if someone's unemployed, they're not going to be able to continue to push the economy in the way it's moving, right? So if they're unemployed, they're no longer going to spend. Then obviously the inflationary rates are going to start dropping, right? This is kind of the reason why a lot of the times they like bringing up job numbers in these instances.
We talk about the Fed, trying to hit the gas pedal on the economy. Well, that car does not react immediately. It's a slow reacting piece of machinery.
We wish it would
the Fed's job
react
to bring
immediately.
inflation down to our 2% goal, and we will do so.
Take the Fed's annual 2% average inflation rate goal. Declaring an inflation target is one way the central bank influences how consumers should think about the power of their dollar.
There was one of the rate hikes that the Federal Reserve did when Jay Powell went out before the microphone to explain why they did this.
The preliminary Michigan reading, it was quite eye-catching. One of the factors in our deciding to move ahead was 75 basis points. Today was what we saw in inflation expectations. We're absolutely determined to keep them anchored at 2%.
And I was like, wow. So that's an example of them wanting to make sure that those stay in line. But I mean, they were very concerned about this.
For example, if households want to avoid higher prices in the future, they might make big purchases now. That behavior shift impacts prices too.
Instead
Right.
of waiting for the dishwasher to maybe break next year when prices might be so much higher, they just go ahead and buy the dishwasher now.
Like, bro, free money, basically.
And when lots of
That's how that
families do
works.
that, then that's going to put additional upward pressure on prices, and that's going to spell trouble for inflation.
The inflation in the 1970s, early 1980s, this was a problem.
I want to have a frank talk with you tonight about our most serious domestic problem. That problem is inflation.
An inflation mentality had taken root.
What's interesting about the current inflationary episode is that we're not seeing a whole lot of buy in advance psychology at all. And this is consistent with the inflation expectations that we were measuring. People were expecting inflation to be high for a year, maybe two,
Multiple
but they expected
years.
it to come down in the long run.
We have much better data right now as far as the Federal Reserve is concerned in trying to measure inflation expectations. We've only had 2 years of high inflation. In the 1970s,
Bro, that's too long. Because the problem is that the high inflation that we've had for these 2 years is ridiculous in comparison to what it was. Like, so if it was up like maybe, bro, 10%, there'll be less complaining. But the problem is that it is absolutely, compared to what it normally is, right? What is it, 3 times what it is? Yeah, bro, this is a problem.
they had a decade. When Paul Volcker took on as Fed chair, he looked at this problem and really put the United States in a recession. Jay Powell as Fed chair has not said we need a recession. The Fed.
That's why I'm saying fire this man. I'm sick of him now, guys. No offense if you like him. But the fact that, listen, lower these interest rates right now. This is not acceptable.
Has no intention of causing a recession. I mean, we might go into a recession.
Well, the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates, hoping to slow down the economy and more specifically, slow down the rate of inflation.
Bro, people are still going to charge on their credit cards. Even though the credit card interest rates have also gone up, obviously, because all the interest rates are risen. But the main source of issue are probably housing and mortgage rates. These are crazy, bro. All right? This is not acceptable. Imagine you buy a house right now, what happens? You have a fixed mortgage, you have a fixed rate. And you spending what, 8% indefinitely? Well, you can't afford that. You can't afford that long term. You can't. You're not going to be able to unless you're able to. If that makes any sense. Right, then you probably don't need a mortgage in the first place.
And so far, they've been doing a pretty good job of it.
The Federal Reserve analyzes
Not
a
a
ton
good
of
job.
data and economic indicators
Sick of it.
to determine its next policy moves.
The Federal Reserve is like the Hoover vacuum of data. So, I mean, they're going to bring in whatever they have. And yet the one that gets a lot of focus is inflation expectations.
Like the New York Fed's survey of consumer expectations and the University of Michigan's survey of consumers, which dates back decades.
And it's been doing this actually since 1946. We interview about 600 people a month via phone. We do a random digit dialing of cell phone numbers, and we give them an interview of about 45 minutes of a core questionnaire of about 60 questions, asking them all about the economy, how they feel about the economy. And specifically of interest right now is how they feel about inflation and where they think it's going. We measure both short-term and long-term inflation expectations.
Short-term inflation expectations are a reference point for predictions in the near future.
As inflation started to kick into gear, consumers were really unhappy about it. And in the beginning, they thought it might be something
temporary,
that was transitory, that maybe it wasn't going to stick. But eventually, of course, they realized that
we
were in this new inflationary era. And of course, short-term expectations went up a lot. Inflation increased dramatically in 2022. Since then, inflation expectations have come down moderately. Now, over 2023, it's actually been really interesting. It seesawed up and down, up and down, up and down over the first 4 months of 2023. And since then, it's come down a little bit and remained fairly stable.
For example, short-term expectations were influenced by supply chain constraints.
I think consumers had some recognition over the last year that there were factors that were peculiar to the current situation. Even if they might last for a while, they didn't expect them to last forever.
Shifting to long-term inflation expectations, what do consumers think will happen within the next few years?
The Fed talks a lot about long-run inflation expectations, and it's clear that that's the measure that they care more about than the one-year expectations. The Fed is absolutely trying to keep long-term inflation expectations down.
The Fed's interest rate moves have a lagging effect, meaning it may shape financial markets before consumers change their behavior when the interest rates shift.
At the end of the day, when those decisions are relevant to them, consumers are very attuned to the total costs of buying a house, of buying a car, buying large durable goods, of their credit card bills.
So the longer inflation stays high, the greater the chances that people say, oh, it's not going back to the way before the pandemic. Inflation is here to stay.
5 to 10-year inflation expectations, it did come up as inflation started to accelerate, but it's been between 2.9 and 3.1% per year. For the last 2 years, it's been remarkably stable, even as inflation has peaked during the last summer and come down considerably since then.
Preliminary results from the September survey showed that long-term inflation expectations fell out of that range and came in at 2.7%. That's closer to both the pre-pandemic inflation expectation levels and the Fed's 2% inflation rate goal.
The long-term expectations in the Michigan survey are not 2%. They're a little higher. But the whole point is they're stable.
Inflation expectation measures are only part of the data.
I'm sick of them being stable.
Analyzed by
Personally.
the Fed.
I think there's reasons always to be cautious with data.
Well, the consumer has been resilient. Companies are still making money. Unemployment is still extraordinarily low. And inflation
this is the problem.
is ticking lower and lower.
I had the opportunity to listen to the Michigan survey. When they got to the inflation expectation question, these are hard questions. It's not like everyone follows the CPI and knows what the inflation was last month. And when I was listening to them, knowing how important inflation expectations were at the Federal Reserve, I kind of took a deep breath, right? Because they're, any survey, it's hard, but it's consistent over time.
One of the biggest fears is the wage price spiral. And the spiral can start with consumers.
If people think inflation is going to be really high, even higher in the future, they might try to negotiate higher wage increases at their job.
Say companies...
Yeah, and then that will basically, if this happens, it's going to basically lock in the inflationary rates. Keep that in mind.
And pay up. They could protect their bottom line by charging higher prices for goods and services.
Indefinitely.
And so once this gets going, it can really get going. We saw this to some extent in the 1970s where there were more unions. And in general, people had cost of living adjustments. So we've seen this before. And what happens then is the Federal Reserve has to come in and do a lot more because they got you to get you to think differently. And that's tough.
On the other hand, we're in a historically strong labor market, which was not the case in the 1970s inflationary episode. People have really strong income expectations, and that's precisely what is supporting robust consumer spending right now.
Happily, We have seen no evidence of a wage price spiral. In fact, workers' wages for a long time, this has changed recently, but for a long time, weren't keeping up with inflation. So they
still not.
May go in and ask for a raise, but they weren't getting it.
Fed Chair Powell recognizes the great strides that have been made to combat high inflation, but also noted that prices are still too high, especially since this deceleration of inflation is still coupled with a strong economy.
We are prepared to raise rates further if appropriate and intend to hold policy at a restrictive level until we are confident that inflation is moving sustainably down toward our objective.
The challenge that I see is the confidence that people in general have over how inflation does come down, and then interest rates and how this all plays out. When we think about all of the various components of inflation, what's going to bring it down? Is that priced into the market today? And I would say no.
It's too soon to declare victory
Pay
in the
attention to
inflation
him.
battle.
Based on this assessment, we will proceed carefully as we decide whether to tighten further or instead to hold the policy rate constant and await further data.
The wrong move could spike unemployment and cause even more economic pain.
The question is, have they raised interest rates and slowed the economy so much that it throws us into a recession?
I mean, the Fed does not control the economy. The Fed doesn't even control interest rates. They have an effect on them, but there's all kinds of other things happening in the world that affect the economy.
Guys, it feels like Jerome Powell is trying to keep interest rates high, like specifically for everything across the board, right? To the point where they have to start firing people. And then you start firing people, you stop their spending, and then the economy will end up kind of resetting a little bit, guys, right? It feels like that may be his overall end game. That feels like that's the scheme. And also, guys, keeping mortgage rates high means less supply of houses on the market for sale, which means it keeps housing prices super high, unnecessarily high, like spending $600,000 for a $200,000 home. Okay, it's basically what that means, because the supply is so low, your money doesn't go anywhere when you're looking to buy a house, and your interest rate is so high. Why would anyone sell their house when they had the golden interest rate, guys, of like 2%? Why would they do that? Come on, guys. No one is doing that. They're going to trade it for a $4,000 mortgage? No. Why would they do that when they're paying like $1,000? Listen, I understand what's happening, but I also do not want the interest rate to be as high as it is. At least half it, and then people will start selling. That'll literally restart at least the real estate aspect of it, guys. Do that, please, immediately. Cut it in half. Give us like a 3.5%. 3.5% people will sell. I'm telling you. But as long as it's like 7-8, no one is going to sell. No one is going to sell. That means everything is going to be super expensive. And as long as everyone keeps paying it, it's just going to remain that exact cost, right? For what? Why would they change it? They know they can get that now. Guys, it's ridiculous. Listen, you guys all have an absolutely amazing day and enjoy your day thoroughly.